8 signs you need space, even from people you love. Stoic philosophy. Introduction. The quiet need for distance. There comes a time in every thoughtful life when something begins to feel heavy. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but gradually. Conversations that once felt warm now feel exhausting. Messages feel like obligations. Even the people you love most begin to feel like noise instead of comfort. And the strange part is this. Nothing is necessarily wrong. No one has betrayed you. No major conflict has happened. Yet something inside you is asking for distance. Most people ignore this feeling. They push through it. They tell themselves they are being selfish, dramatic, or ungrateful. They assume that love means constant availability. They assume that closeness means never needing distance. But Stoic philosophy teaches something very different. Sometimes distance is not rejection. Sometimes distance is restoration. The Stoics believed that a person must regularly return to themselves in order to live wisely. The Roman emperor and philosopher Marcus Aurelius wrote reminders to himself about withdrawing into the inner citadel, a place within the mind where clarity and calm could be restored. He understood something most people forget. If you never return to yourself, you slowly lose yourself. We live in a world that celebrates constant connection. Messages arrive instantly. Expectations are immediate. Availability is assumed. But the human mind was not built for endless interaction. It needs stillness the way the body needs sleep. The Stoic teacher Epictetus taught that peace begins when we understand what belongs to us and what does not. Our thoughts belong to us. Our choices belong to us. Our inner life belongs to us. But if we never create space, even our own mind begins to feel crowded. And the philosopher Seneca warned that being everywhere for everyone is one of the fastest ways to become a stranger to yourself. This video is not about abandoning people. It is not about isolation. It is not about coldness. It is about recognizing when your mind needs room to breathe. Because sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself and for others is to step back long enough to return whole. Here are 8 Stoic signs that you may need space, even from people you love. Sign 1, you feel drained after every interaction. One of the clearest signs that you need space is not anger or frustration, but exhaustion. You finish conversations and feel depleted instead of uplifted. You leave social gatherings feeling heavier than when you arrived. Even simple interactions begin to feel like tasks instead of connections. This kind of tiredness is not always physical. It is often mental and emotional. It comes from constantly responding, constantly listening, constantly adapting yourself to the expectations of others. Over time, this creates a quiet form of fatigue that many people don't recognize until it becomes overwhelming. The Stoics believed that energy is one of the most valuable resources a person possesses. Not just physical strength, but mental clarity and emotional stability. When your energy is constantly spent outward, there is nothing left for inner growth. Imagine a well that is constantly drawn from, but never refilled. Eventually, even the deepest well runs dry. Many people assume that if they love someone, they should never feel drained by them. But this is not realistic. Love does not eliminate the need for rest. Even the strongest bonds require space in order to remain healthy. If you notice that you consistently feel exhausted after interacting with others, it may not mean something is wrong with them. It may simply mean Your mind needs time to recover. Taking space in this situation is not selfish. It is maintenance. Just as muscles need recovery after strain, the mind needs stillness after stimulation. Without recovery, exhaustion becomes resentment, and resentment slowly damages even the strongest relationships. Space prevents that damage before it begins. Sign 2. You no longer hear your own thoughts. Another powerful sign that you need space is when your inner voice becomes faint. You spend so much time responding to others that you stop listening to yourself. Decisions become harder. Your preferences become unclear. You start asking others what you think instead of knowing it for yourself. This happens gradually. At first, it feels normal. You stay busy. You stay engaged. You stay connected. But slowly, something important begins to disappear. Your sense of inner direction. The Stoics believed that wisdom requires reflection. Without reflection, a person becomes reactive instead of intentional. Life becomes a series of responses instead of a series of choices. When you never spend time alone, your thoughts begin to blend with the voices around you. Opinions replace understanding. Noise replaces clarity. Think about the last time you sat in silence with no distractions, no phone, no conversation, no music, just your own thoughts. For many people, that moment is rare, and yet it is in those quiet moments that understanding grows. Without space, you lose the ability to examine your life. Without examination, you lose the ability to guide it. Space is where you remember what matters to you. Space is where you reconnect with your values. Space is where you hear yourself again. If your thoughts feel crowded or distant, it may be a sign that you need distance not from people themselves, but from constant interaction. Because your mind deserves time to speak and to be heard. Sign 3. Small things start irritating you. Irritation is often misunderstood. People assume irritation means anger toward others, but very often, irritation is simply a signal of overstimulation. When your mind is overwhelmed, even small things begin to feel like too much. A message notification feels intrusive. A simple request feels demanding. A harmless comment feels frustrating. The Stoics believe that emotional reactions often reveal deeper conditions. If you are easily irritated, it does not always mean others are doing something wrong. Sometimes it means your internal resources are running low. Imagine carrying a heavy weight all day. At first, it is manageable, but as time passes, even small additional burdens feel unbearable. The problem is not the small burden. The problem is the accumulated strain. The same is true emotionally. If you find yourself becoming irritated by things that normally would not bother you, this may be a sign that you need rest and distance. Space allows your nervous system to settle. It allows your thoughts to slow. It allows your emotional balance to return. Without space, irritation often grows into conflict. Words are spoken that cannot be taken back. Tension builds where none was intended. Distance can prevent damage that closeness sometimes creates. Not all irritation is a sign of a bad relationship. Sometimes it is simply a sign of an overwhelmed mind, and an overwhelmed mind needs quiet more than anything else. Sign 4. You feel responsible for everyone's emotions. One of the heaviest burdens a person can carry is the belief that they are responsible for how others feel. You try to keep everyone happy. You try to avoid disappointing anyone. You try to solve problems that are not yours to solve. At first, this feels like kindness. It feels like compassion. It feels like love, but over time it becomes something else: pressure. The Stoics taught that each person is responsible for their own thoughts and reactions. You can act with kindness, you can speak with honesty, you can behave with integrity, but you cannot control how others interpret or respond. When you try to manage everyone's emotions, you take on a task that is impossible to complete. No matter how hard you try, someone will always feel disappointed, misunderstood, or upset. And when you feel responsible for all of it, your mind never rests. Space helps restore perspective. It reminds you where your responsibility ends and another person's begins. Without that clarity, emotional boundaries disappear. And when boundaries disappear, exhaustion follows. You are allowed to care without carrying everything. You are allowed to love without losing yourself. Sometimes distance is what allows you to return to relationships with healthier boundaries and clearer understanding. Space is not abandonment. It is realignment. Sign 5. You start neglecting yourself. Another sign that you need space is when your own needs begin to disappear from your priorities. You make time for everyone else, but not for yourself. You respond to messages, but ignore your own thoughts. You fulfill obligations, but neglect your well-being. This often happens quietly. There is no dramatic moment when you decide to abandon yourself. Instead, it happens through small choices repeated over time. You skip rest because someone needs you. You delay reflection because you are busy. You ignore your feelings because others come first. Eventually, you begin to feel disconnected from your own life. The Stoics believed that self-respect begins with self-attention. If you do not care for your own mind, you cannot live wisely. If you do not maintain your inner state, you cannot act with clarity. Space is where self-attention becomes possible again. It is where you notice what you feel. It is where you notice what you need. It is where you remember who you are. Without space, self-neglect becomes normal. And what becomes normal eventually becomes invisible. Distance helps you see yourself again, and seeing yourself clearly is the beginning of living intentionally. Sign 6. You feel guilty for wanting distance. One of the clearest signs that you truly need space is guilt. Not guilt from doing something wrong, but guilt simply from wanting time alone. Many people have been taught that distance equals rejection, that needing space means something is broken, that wanting solitude is selfish. But Stoicism teaches the opposite. A person who never withdraws into themselves becomes dependent on constant distraction. And dependency is not strength. Wanting space does not mean you love people less. Often, it means you want to return to them as your best self instead of your most exhausted self. Guilt often appears when you begin setting boundaries. It is a sign that you are changing patterns that once defined your relationships. And change often feels uncomfortable before it feels right. If you feel guilty for wanting distance, it may simply mean you are learning to care for your inner life in a way you never have before. And that is not selfish. That is necessary. Sign 7. Conversations feel forced. When you need space, even natural conversations can begin to feel unnatural. You struggle to find words. You respond out of obligation instead of interest. Silence feels more appealing than interaction. This does not always mean the relationship is failing. Sometimes it simply means your mind is tired. The Stoics valued meaningful speech over constant speech. They believed words should be intentional, not automatic. When conversations feel forced, it may be a sign that your mind needs quiet before it can engage sincerely again. Distance restores authenticity. Without it, interactions become performances instead of connections. And no one can perform forever without exhaustion. Sign 8. You feel the urge to disappear for a while. Perhaps the most obvious sign that you need space is the simple desire to step away, not dramatically, not permanently, just quietly. You imagine time alone. You imagine silence. You imagine being unreachable for a while. This desire is not weakness. It is instinct. The mind knows when it needs recovery, even when the person does not fully understand why. Ignoring this instinct often leads to burnout. Listening to it often leads to renewal. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is step back long enough to return stronger. Conclusion: distance as a form of care. Space is not rejection. Space is not abandonment. Space is not failure. Space is restoration. When you take time to return to yourself, you do not lose your relationships. You strengthen them. Because you return with clarity instead of confusion, patience instead of irritation, and presence instead of exhaustion. The Stoics understood that solitude is not loneliness. Solitude is where the mind rebuilds itself. And sometimes the most loving thing you can say is not goodbye, but simply, I need a little time. Because when you return to yourself, you return better to everyone else too. And that is not distance from love. That is distance for love.